Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale. Non è un'idea. Innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire. Non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli. Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale. Non è un'idea. Innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire. Non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
La civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Buonasera.
Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the 44th edition of the Rimini meeting. This year's meeting slogan, as we all know, is "Human existence is an inexhaustible friendship." Well, today we are witnessing a growing phenomenon in terms of dimension and intensity. And this phenomenon goes against this idea of friendship. I'm referring to what is generally referred to as cancel culture. It is a disturbing, overwhelming phenomenon. For those who are not familiar with this expression, cancel culture means a very strong tendency on social media, but it is now also present in physical public spaces, squares, cultural places, universities, sports areas. It is the trend to erase, to cancel people or symbols for these people that are considered guilty of expressing offensive opinions. Opinions that are in contrast with values that are considered important for some minorities, for some cultural orientations, and opinions that are against the core of values that is now referred to as politically correct. It is a kind of paradoxical phenomenon because in order to defend freedom and values that are considered really important, someone's opinions are cancelled. Those that professes ideas that go against this core of values are not debated, are not argued against. They are just erased, they are cancelled. In the United States, this tendency started before than other places. This took place, for example, in the form of demolishing the statues of Christopher Columbus, as he was accused of being racist and a colonialist. And frankly, I was really struck when I read the decree with which the mayor of the capital city of Ohio ordered to remove the statue of Christopher Columbus. In my side, he is the symbol of a patriarchal conception of reality, oppressive and divisive. And I was particularly struck because this capital city of Ohio is Columbus. So basically, they cancel their company name, so to say. Also, Thomas Jefferson, some weeks ago, was removed from the City Hall of New York City. In this case, and this was verified, the third president of the United States and father of the Declaration of Independence, but it was certain that he had some slaves. Up to some more recent figures, a case that was very much discussed was the one of J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter's author. We would say that this lady is a left-wing person, as she financed the Labour Party and she was against Brexit. She was in favor of remaining in Europe, but at some point she tweeted something in favor of a post that said that a transsexual person was a transsexual person and could not be considered biologically a woman. So for having expressed this kind of opinion, for supporting this post, she was cancelled. She was not invited to any other events, and also the fans of Harry Potter decided to do their events without their loved author. And many more examples could be considered, not just in culture and show business, but also at the university. There's more and more situations where there's people that are forbidden to speak because they bear some ideals or practices that are considered offensive. So it's quite a big and disturbing phenomenon, and it's this epidemic of enmity that Cardinal Zuppi referred to, mentioning the message by Pope Francis to the meeting of Rimini, a sort of cultural bullism, as this was defined in other places. So to discuss this phenomenon that affects us all, and especially to try and understand in which terms today it can be possible to establish a dialogue between different cultures, between different opinions, we have invited through three really distinguished guests, and I mentioned them in alphabetical order. First of all, Professor Sergio Belardinelli, full professor of Sociology of Culture and Communicative Processes at the University of Bologna. He's also a journalist, editorialist, and he's very well known because he is part of our internal debate. And the other guest, and I'm really grateful for having him here, is François-Xavier Bellamy, member of the European Parliament from the Republican Party. Member of the European Parliament, but also French philosopher, professor of philosophy, and he's one of the protagonists of these schools of philosophy that still gathers hundreds and hundreds of young people who are passionate about the big questions of philosophy. And last but not least, Professor Joseph Weiler. He is professor at the New York University, fellow in all the most renowned universities of the world, but especially he is Italian citizen and supporter of Fiorentina, who won the first match in the league. So he is particularly happy. So I would start with Professor Belardinelli, and I would ask him to try and help us understand better this phenomenon. What are the origins? What are the causes? What are the reasons and the context where this phenomenon arises? Right, thank you. We're talking about cancel culture, and it is something on which today there is a real cultural war going on. There is this kind of cultural war over the concept of culture, cancel culture. Of course, it would be impossible to go through the whole story in the 10 minutes I was allotted, so I have to keep an eye on the stopwatch there, so I'll just make some hints. It has already been mentioned in the introduction of this session. Cancel culture is a close relative of what is normally known as political politically correct or political correctness. Towards the end of the 70s, the American left, as is known, tries to shift the attention from social issues, focusing on discriminated groups, women, black people, the LGBT community, and they start work on the language in an attempt to eliminate any chances that this old discrimination may emerge, discrimination of which these groups would be the victims. So this is the beginning of the politically correct. That's a phenomenon, and we could even be quite frank that we could expect that would be end in ridicule unless the social networks had arrived, because in social networks what happens is that that spirit was retaken, it was enhanced, and it has been turned more aggressive indeed. And as Andrea said before, it is now taking the character of a culture of cancellation. So cancel culture is born out of this time, of this process, and it would be impossible to understand cancel culture without thinking about what has changed in communication with the advent of social networks. But the interesting point about this phenomenon is that over time it started in the left, it interests especially the American liberal culture, but not just the American or the British one, and especially, in my view, it's not just about the liberal culture, even the conservatives. If I think about Donald Trump's political campaign, tends to assume these aggressive traits, this debate imbued with identity. This is a particular feature I want to emphasize. There are many more, but this one I want to emphasize because it's quite typical in cancel culture. In the left, we see the fanaticism of this group, of that group, feeling discriminated, and so they try to affirm themselves fanatically. At the same time, similarly, in the right, we see that religion and culture are being used as a means to affirm some sort of identity. It is not just in the United States, and this is happening in alarming ways, because McIntyre, a philosopher I particularly like, at the beginning of the 80s, he had already mentioned a serious danger for all our democracies, and this was that public debate could turn into, and I quote, a civil war carried on by other means. So cancel culture, in my view, is a paradigmatic expression of a debate that tends to assume more and more the characters of a civil war carried on by other means. Now, a question that we may ask ourselves, though it would be really hard to find an answer, is how could all this has happened? Because I believe that our public debates in the West are really suffering from this illness, and it is a serious illness. How could this happen? How could it happen that, for example, the supporter of cancel culture could be so successful. So quite likely, I believe that at the basis of the favor of the support received by this movement, there are for sure the objective discriminations which those groups they refer to did suffer, in particular the black community, or in particular women. Denying this would be dishonest. I mean, we could even learn something from the erasers of culture. On the other hand, Walter Benjamin used to invite to consider always the other side of the history coin and consider ambivalences and tragedies, the tragedy and injustice that lies behind our monuments may teach us something. Why not? We don't have to be afraid of saying this. The fact is that in this strong version of cancel culture, we don't find anything of this. What we can find is a sort of sanitizing activity of history, an attempt to reduce the past to one and only dimension. And this is not right. This is not right. And it's even worse if all this is done with a will, with an intention of, let's say, removing everything that does not comply with what we like. So, as I said, how could all this happen? In a minute and a half, I can say that for sure, in the background, towards the end of the 70s, Christopher Lasch and McIntyre himself, Christopher Lasch denounced the culture of narcissism. The culture of narcissism discussed by Lasch is definitely one of the main conditions that made it possible for cancel culture to affirm. Similarly, the moral emotivism discussed by McIntyre, that is the idea of what is right, the criterion of what is right should coincide with what I feel as such. So these are some assumptions that we all know, especially at the meeting. These things are very well known, have contributed to erode the foundations of our Western culture more than anything else. And to conclude, even people from the left realized this. In 2019, in Harper's Magazine, 150 intellectuals, most of them from the left, denounced the worry about the fact that now dialogue is not possible. Be careful, because we're taking the wrong direction. When one is tired of making bad examples, one starts teaching. So I conclude with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Belardinelli. You really described in a very good way some of the, to say, genetic aspects. And you were perfectly in time. You probably don't know, but we have counters in front of us signaling that the time that we're allotted to speak is running. So I was saying that it is indeed very true that we are living in climate of war, and it's really terrible to talk about a war, especially in these times. It is as if the war has gone out of the fields and entered the cultural climate that we inhabit. I'd like now to leave the floor to Professor Bellamy. I'd like to learn from you as a professor who is very much committed in the field of education, and now that you are a member of the European Parliament. What is your take on this phenomenon? What are its causes and what are its dimensions? So thank you very much, and thanks for your warm welcome. Apologies for not being able to speak in Italian. I will have to shift to French. I would like to thank you very much for your warm welcome, and I would also like to thank the interpreters allowing me to speak with you. So, Professor Belardinelli, you really perfectly explained the extent of this phenomenon and the challenges that the cancel culture poses. A few days ago, I happened to meet Sergio coming from the United States. This young woman was visiting the European Parliament and asked what the most difficult thing in European universities is, and she answered that the most difficult thing is actually not to be a victim of this cancel culture. It's very easy to be subject of that. It's very easy to make a mistake that could offend anyone, and I recognize that this is true also in my work. For example, my colleagues, my colleague professors in France published data on this. Over 52% of them declared that they self-censor themselves during lectures because they feared that they could offend students vis-à-vis their beliefs or ideas. So it is professors themselves who self-censor themselves because they try and avoid to be confronted with the cancel culture. So they kind of refrain from saying things openly. Even in the public debate, you know that the most important thing is that we should avoid to use terms that could be against the politically correct way of speaking. And where does this cancel culture stem from? Professor Belardinelli mentioned this continuous analysis that one makes of history. I remember myself as a philosophy student, and back then I remember that I read a book published by an American university, Justice, Gender, and the Family was the title of the book. And the book was about the fact that Aristotle had no longer to be read because he did not see in the polis the same role to men or women. And furthermore, he justified slavery in politics. It seems to me that this is an example of the fact that we lack humbleness, that we lack humanity. When I read Aristotle, actually Aristotle says that he justifies slavery, and the first thing that I reflect upon is the fact that as a human being I have to be careful. If such an extraordinary brain like that of Aristotle, who was capable of actually the foundations of Western physics, of developing a way of doing politics that is still valid in our institutions, Aristotle, who studied the functioning of nature of human beings and of animals, actually, if such a brain committed such mistakes, well, I can make mistakes too. So we need to be humble in this respect, and at the same time, we need to also acknowledge how we are. Actually, we are not the repository. I am not the repository of truth, and therefore this lack of humility, this lack of humbleness made the political debate worse. So if I feel offended by someone, I may be authorized by the fact that I can cancel him. But this actually stems from basically the lack of civil dialogue in our countries, and that is based on relativism. Again, as a philosophy student, I remember Cardinal Ratzinger. He was not, he had not become a pope back then, and he spoke about the dictatorship of relativism. We all know what a dictatorship is, so I basically didn't have the impression that I was living in a dictatorship. But then gradually, when I became a professor and I started teaching philosophy and I started meeting students, I remember that every year I started my courses by dealing with the topic of truth, because actually philosophy is about looking for truth. So you have to define that. What are you looking for? What is truth? How can you find something and look for it if you don't know what it is? And so I asked my students, how would you define truth? And I asked this question several times, and the first student raising his or her hand would say that the truth depends on the people, and that was not even an answer. It is as if I said, actually, what is a car? And then if someone had answered, well, people have different cars, they drive different cars. It's just a way of protecting yourself. We are afraid of the idea of truth, and so we try and argue in favor or against something because of this, and then you go to this principle, first principle of logic that was formulated by Aristotle. Basically, the principle is about the fact that in using Aristotle's words, a door can be open or closed. If you're talking about an open door and we're sure that we're giving words the same meaning, if we look at a door and we think that that door is open while another person thinks that the same door is closed, we cannot say that everybody's right. There must be someone who's wrong out of the two. So this idea is apparently the starting point of absolute intolerance, the starting point of any war of religion. My students would often tell me, okay, professor, fine with the door, but let's talk about God. Well, in the case of God, it's very easy. If someone in the room believes that God exists and other people believe that he does not exist, if we are sure that we attribute the word God and the word exist the same meanings, well then, it cannot be that everybody is right at the same time, is simultaneously right. That appears to be an outrageous act of intolerance. And I am even afraid of expressing this thought before you, but in fact, this is the very basis of any dialogue, because I believe that God exists and you believe that he doesn't exist. Well, then it's important to debate, to talk about this. And here comes this act of humility that we so desperately need. Those who profoundly believe in what they say are humble. They are indeed humble. If they truly believe in what they say, they do not want to silence others. Actually, wanting other people to stay silent means that we do not truly believe in what we say. Because if we are so weak, if we are so frail that we cannot even listen to an argument that is against my thoughts, well, that means that I do not trust my ideas, and that I do not trust myself nor in the other, and that I am not humble enough of recognizing that the other person might teach me something, and that something might help me understand. It is exactly from here that the miracle of dialogue might stem. The cancel culture stems from this inability to be humble and from this relativism. So if I say, okay, this is my truth, this is your truth, this is their truth, well, everybody has their own truth, and we are like kind of bubbles of certainty, but they're distant one from the other. They are not going to meet, and so the truth of the other becomes intolerable for me. I don't want to listen to it. I do not even accept that it exists in the world. However, if we accept that we do not use a possessive adjective before the word truth, and we accept that truth is a common good that we all aspire to, that it is what we're looking for, that it is what we are heading to, we're all heading to, then we are willing to listen to the other. And the other may help us, may teach us something, and may open my eyes towards the search for truth. When Pascal talks about Aristotle, Blaise Pascal back then, when he talked about Aristotle, was slightly older than 20, and he had just made a discovery thanks to the Italian physicist Torricelli, and he was capable of discovering that vacuum exists in nature. All researchers actually say that nature is horrified against vacuum, and Torricelli said, actually, it is, Blaise Pascal answered, well, because of, I am so humbled before Aristotle that I feel that I need to progress with his work. Actually, I feel dwarfed was Aristotle, but I wanted to raise on the shoulder of the giant Aristotle, and by doing so, looking further ahead. This metaphor was used by Pascal to show that thanks to this act of being humble, you are not denying your own liberty, but you are rather but you have the chance not to cancel the others, and you can, in a way, step on the ideas of the others and possibly also on the errors of on the mistakes of the others. In this way, by listening to the others, we may even progress even more. So this act of humbleness is an act of recognition, and it is the conditio sine qua non. It is the absolute prerequisite for knowledge. It's based on a fundamental prerequisite, which is breaking with relativism and with the affirmation that relativism has to induce us to believe that we are the repositories of truth. Instead, we need to look for the inability to be possessors of truth in order to search for the truth together and bring forward friendship. And friendship is, in fact, the topic of this year's edition. So what you've told us has been really very dense and intense. This desperate need for truth. We are not possessors. We're not holders of the truth, but we're possessed by truth. So let's now move on to Professor Weiler. What is the relationship with the cancel culture based on your experience? Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have 10 minutes, right? And then additional 10 minutes later on. So in the first 10 minutes allotted to me, I would like to talk about 7 instances of cancel culture. My aim in talking about the 7 episodes is to show that it is a very complex actor. Sometimes you might even be in favor of canceling, of the cancel culture. 4 of these instances are personal. The first one is the following. 20 years ago, in 2003, I came to the Rimini meeting for the first time. Can you imagine this is the 20th year that I come to the Rimini meeting? Actually, I'm becoming old, I have to admit. So 20 years ago, I presented my book, L'Europa Cristiana, the Christian Europe, that was an edition that was published by a Sicilian publisher. It was published in August in order to allow me to present it at the Rimini meeting, and then I sent it elsewhere to other publishers. Feltrinelli actually said no to this book. They told me that the book was not in line with the editorial guidelines of Feltrinelli. In Germany, no publisher was willing to publish the book. Suakamp and others were not gay. In France, another publisher, Serp, actually said that I could have the chance to publish the book, but by adding a question mark at the end of the title. So the book was eventually published in 9 languages, and it turned out to be a fantastic bestseller. But that's just a very, very easy example for me of cancel culture. because actually it is a fierce betrayal of the academic tradition. You don't need to be a negationist. I mean, if you don't, this is just an argument. If you don't like the book, you may write a review against the book and maybe say that Weiler was stupid in writing this book. And in fact, I did receive reviews stating precisely this, but refusing to publish the book because it is not in line with the editorial guidelines of the publisher is not acceptable. Then I have a second episode, a second instance I'd like to share with you, and that's connected with the Rimini meeting. 10 years ago, you probably remember that there was a photographic exhibition, and there were 28 photographs exhibited, 14 referred to people and 14 to places. There were pictures about people, because I wanted to show people all over the world, from Italy to Australia. Some of these people were renowned people, others were ordinary people, all of them as examples of people with human dignity. So this exhibition was shown in various countries, and it then landed in my university. So after a couple of weeks, the head of my department came to my office and told me that I had to eliminate a picture. The picture by a given photographer. This is the new Cologne. 4 girls in a square in Warsaw. So the new Poland, sorry, not the new Cologne. So in 4 girls in a square in Warsaw. Apparently this picture was not appreciated, was not liked by someone, and so I was asked to basically remove this picture. Actually, I told this person thank you, because I was going to be in the first pages of the New York Times because of this. And actually he replied that he could not insist of keeping this picture. So what I did was that I removed the whole exhibition. So without that picture, I didn't want to have the exhibition. Third episode. This is a painting in my flat in Madrid. I was within the framework of a committee at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and that was the background of during this meeting. After the meeting, the director of the institute told me that actually that painting could not be used as a background of my room. So I thanked the person and immediately resigned from that committee. Of course, I mean, that picture, it is understandable that the painting could be offensive. The painter is a very important Spanish painter, a feminist. But what I didn't like, and that's the reason why I bring to you this example, is how they did that. They didn't ask. They didn't try to understand. They simply sent an email of 2 lines and told me that I had to cancel, to eliminate that painting, and that's why I decided to resign. And then I'd like to share with you a couple of examples which are not personal examples, just to show some complex situations. In Kiev, there was a Pushkin alley. Pushkin was the famous Russian poet. Last year, in the Ukraine, they canceled the Pushkin alley and they gave it another name, because Pushkin, in his poetry, was in favor of the Russian imperialism, like Kipling, who was the supporter of the British imperialism. Well, in this case, I find it difficult. This is a complex situation. I feel a deep empathy for the Ukrainians. The very same Putin currently uses currently refers to Pushkin to mobilize the Russians. And so actually you are faced with a dilemma. Should we cancel or should we not cancel? There is no easy answer in this case. Another instance of cancel culture is even more difficult. There's a famous American photographer, Mapplethorpe, who did a very famous, a very notorious photograph. This photograph depicted Jesus on the cross in a bottle, and that bottle also contained the urine of Mapplethorpe. So if you go to a private museum, of course, there's the maximum artistic freedom. But then the American Art Foundation, so a publicly funded body in the U.S. awarded this piece of art with an award, with a prize. And this was followed by a huge debate by the fact that many American citizens were concerned of the fact that they didn't want to give an award to that picture. So whose side would you be on? Would you give the prize, or would you remove the prize from the... So then there's a last example I'd like to give you, and that's a hypothesis. Do you remember the tragedy in Marzabotto? 700 innocents were killed by the Nazis. There were 2 German officers who were in charge of this crime. Let's now make an assumption. Let's assume that in the country of one of these officers, for example, Austria, let's assume that they decided to honor this officer and erect a sculpture of this officer. And let's assume that people protest against this, that they should, in a way, eliminate and bring down the statue. In this case, whose side would you be on? Would you be in favor of freedom, or would you be in favor of those who are in favor of the cancel culture? So in my following 10 minutes, I would like to suggest, to propose to you some ways to kind of counter this cancel culture. Thank you.
Ringrazio.
Thank you, Professor Weiler. I thank you especially because, as always, there would be a way to address the topic of cancel culture that paradoxically it could use the same method, that is canceling those that cancel. Instead, with these examples, you have helped us understand that it is necessary to take a stance anyway, and that humility that Professor Bellamy mentioned before is always something that is played out in a freedom that is necessary to accept or not to accept what is being opposed. So we don't want to propose a formal method to solve this issue. So I would start the second round of interventions to go deeper on this. So back to Professor Belardinelli. Given the causes and focusing on the profound reasons of this issue that is being expressed in the way that we have mentioned, so what is the prospect? What would be a position able to restore dialogue, considering the conflict that is going on? I believe the answer to the question can be found in Bellamy's presentation. I believe that the issue of truth is precisely the issue on which our attitude can be determined even with respect to cancel culture. You said it very well. Assuming towards cancel culture an attitude that is in itself an attempt to cancel should be avoided. So what do we have to try and avoid this mistake? It is the good way to understand truth. Kant said that a glimpse of truth can be found even in the most exuberant opinion amongst the people. This is not to say that everything should be accepted, but this point is to take a stance, and I would like to use a buzzword that is inclusive towards diversity without being relativist. I myself have some fear in reading when liberal culture sometimes takes certain stances towards cancel culture, and it is this. After celebrating the beginning of the era of the post-truth, which is the word of the year of the Oxford Dictionary 2016 edition. So after celebrating this, a certain culture all of a sudden has discovered that there's figures around, such as Putin and Trump, who use social networks, and the only way to tackle what happens with this use is rational discourse, reality, and ultimately truth. So the fear is that by having found out this is that truth may start being used in a despotic manner, as if in public space only true opinion may have the right of citizenship. To make it clear, I must say immediately that I don't like this. There are political reasons that make me think that this should not happen, and there's more philosophical, noble reasons that were mentioned before by Professor Bellamy. I'd like to summarize the political reasons in a kind of slogan for me, because I've been saying this for 20 years. In a community of free and equal people, it is far better to have a shared mistake than a truth imposed by force. This is the reason why politically I'm always dubious when I feel that there is an excessive strength in trying to disregard the most exuberant positions, even in public debate. But one should be calm and take seriously that idea of dignity that lies at the basis of Western political culture, and that we should maybe keep quite dear to us, because that's the idea of truth that can help us say what I mentioned before. Why do we make decisions by majority? Not because the majority is right, but because in a community of free and equal people, it's far better to have a mistake than an imposed truth, where nobody has the rights and the freedom to impose anything against the freedom of the others. So it should be a prudent use of freedom. When it comes to cancel culture, I see that where it can be found most fiercely expressed is with respect to history, the past. I think that it is possible to learn a lot from some extreme positions, because the American greatness may come from that light emanating from a hill back there, but perhaps we might even consider acquiring this, considering the plantations. I wouldn't forget about that issue. One can learn, but it is possible to do it with the right spirit, The important thing is to do it with humility, with openness to learning from the other, learning to be reminded of what we have forgotten about or we have removed for some reason. So this is especially present with respect to history. Truth is always quite restless and changing. There's not just one and only interpretation of facts. Facts are multifaceted, and many interpretations are possible as they even shape our freedom and our thinking in many different ways, as we can say things the way we like, but what we cannot do is to disrupt reality. What we cannot and do not want to do is to intentionally lie, as Hannah Arendt said. The contrary to true, when we talk about historical facts, is not what is false, but it is intentional lying. So if this is the attitude that we should all take on, it is clear that with respect to cancel culture too, we should have that spirit that Professor Weiler mentioned before. We cannot just take our truths and give them priority over history. The accuracy, as Carl used to say, is a duty, is not a virtue for historians. It is a duty that we have towards reality. That's a possible orientation to try and find our way in the complicated situation that is made so fearful and aggressive by cultural erasers that are present at all latitudes. They are present everywhere. I would like to conclude just by saying one final point. Human existence is an inexhaustible friendship is the title of this year's meeting. Now, about friendship, Aristotle said something really nice. He used to recommend it to politicians and saying that it is far more important, friendship is far more important than justice, because when one is a friend, there is no need for justice. While when one is just, there is still a need for friendship. A society still needs friendship despite having justice. So I would say this in a low tone, but the strongest antidote to fanaticism and the identity movements of cancel culture, the strongest antidote is precisely the spirit of truth and friendship. I think this is what it is possible to learn when we discuss and we talk about this warring phenomenon. Thank you.
Grazie. Professor Bellamy.
Professor Bellamy. To start and answer and comment on what has just been said, I can say that going back to your instances, I would like to go back to the last questions you posed. Clearly, there are moments in which the very same right for freedom can lead to the condemnation of somebody when that person has done or said something in the public sphere that is offensive for the freedom of the other. In some cases, I think that it is necessary to kind of withdraw a gratuitous offense or a lie, because I am also a liberal, and I believe that true freedom consists in responsibility, and responsibility means that we need to try and be accountable towards what we have said or done. It's not just a matter of kind of having the right of saying whatever we want or offending whomever we want. So using the idea that we need to fight against cancel culture is not freedom at any cost. We want to have a kind of freedom that can trigger dialogue, that is inclined towards having the answer of the other, that is not a prevarication over the other, but whose aim is to convince the other. And to do that, you need a conversation, you need a dialogue, and you need to acknowledge that the ultimate freedom resides in conscience, and conscience cannot be violated. I can never violate the other to believe in what I say, because the other person too cannot be forced in believing in what I say. Even if he or she wanted, if he cannot believe in what I say, he or she cannot believe in that. If I want this to be true, I need to convince the other, or I need to be convinced by the other. And that's actually the kind of freedom that we defend. And there's an aspect that I would like to stress, which is, in my opinion, fundamental. I believe that the first virtue we need in the future is courage. We need courage. And we need courageous, brave people. Freedom never steps back. Even if there are lots of people who will try to combat freedom, there will always be minorities who will be there to protect freedom. We need to protect and defend freedom. Sometimes we are tempted because we are cowards, and sometimes we don't do that, but we need to be brave. So stepping away from relativism means fighting in favor of our own convictions. Why do we go to university if we are not willing to be offended, and if we are not willing to listen to something that can shock us in our thoughts? This is something that I say clearly to my students. Why do you go to university? You go to university, you attend university because you're there to learn something new, something that you don't know, something that is not immediately visible. Let's assume that you want to study astronomy, and you start your course by telling your professor, okay, dear professor, in my mindset, I believe that the Earth is not moving and that it's the other planets that move around the Earth. So I cannot be offended in my beliefs. When I am told that the Earth rotates, I am not convinced, and well, maybe the professor might tell me that I'm not the right astronomy student, that I should maybe opt for another subject if I am not willing to renounce my beliefs. Because if our eyes tell us that the Earth is immobile, we need to fight against ourselves to search for truth. There was a work of art by Plato, and there was a conversation between Plato and Socrates, and you probably know that Socrates is always very ironic, used to be very ironic. He always posed very ironic questions to his interlocutor, Gorgia, and he would basically replied, okay, now I will stop talking. And Socrates replied, what kind of man are you then? And Socrates replied, I am a man who loves being rejected. Because if I am proven that I am wrong, well, then I am happy that I am faced with the truth showing me that I was making a mistake. I like that there are other people showing me that I am wrong. And this is what actually Socrates tells Gorgias. So I always like when other people I like proving to others that sometimes they're wrong, and even if, and as I'm also very, very selfish, I prefer to be corrected than to correct the others. Political life would be much, much nicer, much more beautiful if inside a debate we were able to tell our interlocutor, thank you, because thanks to you I understood that I was wrong about this. This way we would find the meaning of the public debate again. People who are there to win at any cost are there because they want to convince. And to do that, you need to be brave. You need to be courageous. You need to be brave towards yourself in the first place. Relativism is very convenient in a way. You have your own truth. You protect your own truth against anybody. You kind of erase, you cancel all those who do not think like you, and you live in your tiny world of certainties. So your intellectual reality and recognizing reality as the commonplace uniting us, that requires courage. And that's the condition that we have to learn. I think I disagree with the title of this debate. So, erasing cultures or building cultures. I believe that the real answer to cancel culture does not lie in building a culture, but rather in receiving a culture. So in rediscovering what it means to convey and to receive a culture. And this is what I've tried to express in a book I wrote on the crisis of education in France. This is a crisis which, in my opinion, is affecting not only France but the whole of Europe. That crisis stems from lack of courage. And courage means also the courage to answer the others and to kind of reply to this temptation that is represented by the cancel culture. If you want to fight relativism, you need courage. And to be a politician today, and my friend Lorenzo Malago, with whom I've talked a lot about this, knows this very well. I mean, he knows that you need to be brave to be a politician today. But we're all politicians because we are all citizens. We are all repositories of the public debate and of democracy. So that's why in our businesses, in our families, in our friendship relationships, sometimes we must be able to say that we reject this relativism, even in the simplest things. For example, you were talking about J.K. Rowling. Today, actually claiming what J.K. Rowling said and saying that there is a biological difference between men and women apparently presupposes being brave, and sometimes it becomes difficult. It's difficult in the public debate, and it's difficult also at the parliament. However, I think we desperately need to do this whenever this is necessary. Relativism consists in the denial to see reality. Peggy, and there's a wonderful exhibition on him, said that we need to be brave to say what we see, and above all, we need to be brave to see what we are actually saying. I think it is precisely this courage that we desperately need today. And this makes me, this induces me to think about Chesterton and what he wrote, and this might also appear a bit orthodoxical. I would also like to thank the interpreters who helped us. I would like to apologize for not giving them a text on what I am about to say. So probably it's going to be difficult to translate the cited by in his last lines. Chesterton writes, everything will be denied and everything will become a belief. And therefore, we will try and affirm that the grass is green in the summer. Fires will be ignited to show that 2 + 2 makes 4. And we will be induced to defend not only the big virtues of human existence, but also something that is even more incredible, that is to say, the very same existence of this wonderful and impossible universe that we need to be confronted with. So we will contemplate the impossible grass, and we will be animated by a belief, and we will be among those who will have seen and who will have nonetheless believed. So we will be among those who will have seen and we will have believed. I believe that this effort, this kind of courage, is what awaits us, that we need today, and which are really at the basis of the friendship that brings us together to work around this fundamental task, which is the search for freedom, trying to protect the sense of marvel that still today can be for us. And so this kind of search that we need to preserve for future generations. Thank you very much.
Grazie. Grazie davvero. Professor Weiler.
So, Professor Weiler, I'm looking at my watch. Well, freedom of expression is a fundamental right, but there's another, actually more fundamental right, which is actually the right to have our dinner on time. Well, actually, they all know, so they will wait. Well, I have to disappoint you, because after the examples I gave you, starting from the first one, which was quite clear, I mean, that was an unjustified cancel act, and then moving on to the hypothetical example of Marzabotto, I assume that the majority would agree on the fact that it would be justified to cancel, so to be in favor of cancel culture. Well, in these cases, problems are in between of this continuum. So what I can say, what I can share with you today is just a few parameters that may help us. However, I believe with my two colleagues, the common sense, then courage, that's also fundamental. And I would also add some notes to what has been said. To me, the starting point is represented by Voltaire. I am against what you say, but I will defend your right to express this till I'm dead. So before we cancel, we should really think about having very, very good reasons to cancel, even if what we're going to cancel is offensive. So a person, a work of art, a book, a poem. The freedom of expression is valid only if we defend the expression that is offensive, that offends us, that we do not like, that we are against. That's the starting point. Second, as we heard, sometimes this request to cancel something comes from minorities, and in this case, we need to be empathetic. So if we are members of a majority, we need to, in a way, think as if we were members of a minority, of that minority. To respect minorities and to respect in general, we should think that there might be cases which are more important for us. So social solidarity, for example, might be more important than this kind of hard principle of the freedom of expression. As a Jew, if I were to cancel all those who are in favor of anti-Semitism in history, well, my library would be empty. Starting from Dostoevsky, Céline, T.S. Eliot. I mean, he was convinced against the Jews. So Would you like to, do you really want to cancel Dostoevsky or T.S. Eliot or Celine? So even if I am empathetic towards minorities, even if I feel empathy towards minorities, we can support that. I mean, do you just think that the Bible started with, in principle, God created heaven and the earth? Well, no, it was not like that. Actually, it started like in the following way. In principle, God created heaven, the earth, and anti-Semitism. So even if you're sympathizing with some minorities, you have to feel empathy. And sometimes you have to suffer because also the general culture is important. Third principle, context. So public and private context. Let's take a private museum. Actually, in a private museum, you may exhibit the Mapplethorpe photograph because you may decide to go or not to go. But if you exhibit a statue in a public square, people cannot avoid passing by. They must see it. So you have to adopt different considerations depending on the context, depending on the space. In the context of a museum, that's also very important context because we know that art history, we know from art history that there have always been artists canceling certain, who've seen their works of art cancelled, and now they've become the great artists. So museums have a task consisting in provocation. They need to go beyond consensus, while in a public square, consensus is more important. Then a fourth principle. Is there another way to use rather than canceling? Let me give you a couple of examples. There's Carl Schmitt, a famous German jurist. I am a constitutionalist, and you cannot implement constitutional theory without making reference to Carl Schmitt. But he was a Nazi. He was the one who legitimized Hitler's power. I was once contacted by an American journal who actually asked my opinion about whether it was appropriate to publish someone always quoting or citing Carl Schmitt. In my personal view, and that was the solution that I proposed to that journal, was the following. When I quote or cite Carl Schmitt, and I have to do that because, I mean, he's a famous scholar, I always say, as the Nazist Carl Schmitt writes, this is because even if he was a great jurist, from a personal point of view, he did something. And this is something that actually applies to others. George Washington. I mean, there's a statue of George Washington everywhere. Actually, he had slaves. So what do we do with him? Do we eliminate all the statues of George Washington? But you can add a plate and actually remind people of the fact that George Washington was not a saint, that he held slaves. So we can find a way not to cancel, but at the same time, we're showing the sensibility of those who are in favor of the cancel culture. In other words, we're showing that we're not trying to hide away the things that are offensive coming from these people. And this should serve as a principle. Before canceling, we should always ask ourselves if there's a way to kind of respecting the public sensitivity and the sensitivity of those who get offended, even ourselves. Sometimes there are alternatives to canceling. And these alternatives might consist in highlighting certain aspects, like the example I gave of Carl Schmitt. Now, I'd like to reply to my two colleagues. All in all, what we need is common sense. We need to think, we need to show empathy, and we need to sympathize, we need to show kindness, because actually decisions define us as a society. Sometimes we might simply say, okay, I understand. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to say no. In other cases, we can say, okay, I don't want and I cannot offend this minority. The context is always very important. In today's climate, I believe that courage is important. Today, it takes a lot of courage. The courage to automatically resist this temptation to always side with the good. Even if you, sympathize with them. However, sometimes there may be other values at stake. I'd like to finish 1 minute earlier because we have a fundamental right, which is the right to dinner. As I do not want to violate this fundamental right that Professor Weiler was mentioning, I would like to thank our dear guests wholeheartedly. They helped us reflect in a reasonable way, also because they've given us very practical suggestions like the one that Joseph has given us on how to deal with this issue. I would like to add one final remark, which in my view is the kind of fil rouge. We focused on the phenomenon of cancel culture that stems from this idea that truth can be violent. The issue of relativism and of the dictatorship of relativism is this prerequisite because of which if we actually focus on truth in a discussion, automatically means that you are excluding someone, that you are establishing an area in which people are either inside or outside. So truth is considered as a theoretical model. And if the truth does not correspond to that model, well, then it's wrong. Based on this, I would like to remind you that Christianity has a great advantage when it comes to debating the cancel culture, and that also corresponds to a common responsibility. And this is actually what the Pope, in his message to the Rimini meeting, said. Reality is not a theory. Reality is a person, and that changes our relationship to life. The very same liberal hypothesis that was mentioned today, focuses on this aspect. And I think that here we should think on the fact that the truth is always a relationship towards another person. And it is precisely in this that we are introduced in the reality of things. And that is why I would like to end this meeting, this session, by reminding the words mentioned by Pope Francis, who said that he hopes that the Rimini meeting continues promoting the culture of a meeting open to everybody, nobody, without exception, because in everyone there is a reflection of the Father who gives to everyone life and breath and evening. May each of the participants learn to approach others in the way of Jesus, who always extends his hand, always tries to raise, so as to ensure that people may heal, be happy, and encounter God, so that social friendship and friendship between peoples may grow. I think this is the great hope that we can express from after this meeting, after this session, for which I would like to thank Professor Belardinelli, Professor Bellamy, and Professor Weiler very much. And I would like to remind you that there is one thing that we shouldn't cancel, which are the spots in the trade fair area where you can donate. You know that the Rimini meeting exists because of donations. So if you want to cancel all the rest, but not those spots, and do donate. Thank you very much to everybody, and enjoy your dinner. Wow.
la civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli